tonight to teach our class. Don't mean I'm going to overlook you fellers sitting over there. What we're going to learn about tonight is another book in the Bible, but before we do, I want a volunteer. Tell me what you remember about the book of Matthew. Which one of you wants to volunteer first? All right, all right, okay. Now you tell me what you remember about the book of Matthew. Okay, he's a great apostle, that's true. But the book itself, do you remember anything in particular about the book? Yes, ma'am? Ma'am? Okay. 27 chapters? 28 chapters. Did you say 28? Okay, good. I'm having a little bit of a problem hearing. All right, there's 28 chapters. The title of the book is Matthew. What does that title signify? What does it tell us? Huh? Well, now that's what the book. That's what that Matthew means. But what does when you say Matthew in the Bible, what does it mean? What does that give us? Does that tell us anything about that book? Who wrote that book, guys? Okay, that's what it tells us. Okay, if Matthew wrote the book, and it's one of four, there are four books. What are the first four books, Emma, in the New Testament? You remember start with Matthew. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Very good. Those four books are titled the Gospels, okay? Now, it's very important that we keep this in mind. When you say Matthew, and you look at the first book, that's the man that wrote the book. Now, I told you a little something about Matthew. Tell me about Matthew as a person. What was he? What was his lineage?
Tax collector.
Huh?
Tax collector.
Okay, he's a tax collector. That was his job, which is also called not just tax collector, but what else is it called? Publican. Okay, that was very unpopular, wasn't it? Okay, but Matthew was a Jew or Gentile? Jew. He's a Jew. Okay, remember that. It's very important because Matthew was a Jew. Now, Matthew's writing a book about Jesus Christ. He's writing about Jesus. And Matthew's writing to who? To the Jews. He's a Jew writing about, to the Jews, writing about a Jew, which Jesus was. Okay? Now, those things are important for us to remember as we study in the Bible, the simple things. And that's what we got to start with, the simple things. Now, in this book, Matthew writes about Jesus, but he tells us a lot about Jesus. He tells us about, first of all, his genealogy. Okay, what does that mean, his genealogy? If I say, can you trace your genealogy, what are you going to do?
Isn't the genealogy...
You're looking at your kinfolks, okay? That's what you're doing. When you're tracing your genealogy, you're looking back at your kinfolks, and that tells you where you came from. Okay, that's what genealogy means. Okay, in the book of Matthew, we see the genealogy of Jesus. That means it tells us all about where Jesus, who begat who, and who begat who, and who begat who was his grandfather, who was his mother, who was his father, all that. That tells us a lot about Matthew, okay? In the Bible, in the book of Matthew, we have the genealogy, but we also have something very important about Jesus in this book. It has to do with baptism, okay? Now, Jesus had to be baptized, but it wasn't for the remission of sins, okay? Jesus was baptized to fulfill all righteousness. That means if Jesus is he's going to be our Savior, he's going to put forth the example, he's going to be baptized, and he's going to be baptized to fulfill righteousness, not for the commission of sin, because Jesus did not commit sin. Jesus was the only perfect individual to ever live upon the earth. Now, think about this for a moment. In the book of Matthew, there's a host of miracles. Who performs these miracles in the book of Matthew? the apostles, and also Jesus. It talks about Jesus' miracles. It talks about Jesus' his genealogy. It talks about a lot of the things concerning, but also Matthew was the son of somebody that we have record of. Anybody remember that name? The son of what? The son of Alphaeus. Okay? In Mark chapter 2, verse 14, I told you about him being called the son of Alphaeus. Now, tax collector for the Roman government, but now the publicans and the tax collector was a hated individual. And how did Matthew become a disciple or an apostle? How did he get that job? By the Lord Jesus, okay? Now, let's think about something else right here. And I won't make it hard on you guys trying to think about all this stuff, but things that were in the book of Matthew that I wanted you to remember most especially, there were some events that occurred in the book of Matthew. Now, we're just doing an overview right now because we're going to talk a little bit about Mark here in just a minute. But in Matthew, we find something else about the church. Anybody remember what that was? Somebody else was involved in that. Matthew 16, verses 16 through 19. Anybody remember that? That's exactly right. Simon Peter answered and said, Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus answered and said unto him, Blessed art thou, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood hath not revealed this unto thee, but by my Father which is in heaven. And I say unto you, that upon this rock, this good confession that was made, that I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I want you to remember, guys, and think about this for a minute. I know you probably know this, Ian. Where was this at in the Bible? This was in Matthew, what chapter? 16. And its verse is what? 16 through 19. Good. Very good. So, there was something else that I wanted you to remember in the book of Matthew that was very important as far as Jesus is concerned. It come to us as what? What am I doing tonight? I'm teaching. What was the thing that I told you to remember in the book of Matthew about Jesus' teaching? He did what? What was it he did in Matthew chapter 5?
Sermon on the Mount.
Sermon on the Mount. Thank you, Ian. And this was a very important part of this. Now, also, in the book of Matthew, he chose 12 disciples, apostles. Okay? Where did I tell you that was? Anybody remember that? What chapter? Matthew chapter 10. It doesn't hurt to take notes if y'all want to. Y'all can do that. In fact, it helps sometimes to go back and look at this stuff. The latter part of the book of Matthew deals with something very, very tragic and very, very sad. Does anybody remember what chapter that's in and what it was? Sarah, you remember? Chapter 27. And that deals with what? The crucifixion. That's exactly right. Now, this is important. The miracles that Jesus did, and all throughout the Bible, there were a lot of things that were involved in the miracles. There were diseases that was healed, okay? There were demons that was cast out. Okay, there's death. There's all kind of bringing back to life. Jesus did the miracles, performed the miracles. We find this in Matthew chapter 8 through Matthew chapter 11. Now, those are some highlights on the book of Matthew. We're not through with the book of Matthew. We're going to look at some more things about the book of Matthew, but tonight we're going to look at just some of the same things that I told you about Matthew. Now, next week, I want you guys this week, all of you, as many of you as want to, take and write down what you remember that I told you about the book of Matthew. Just take a piece of paper and a pencil and just write down what you can remember that I told you about the book of Matthew, okay? I'm working on a test. I got sick this week. I didn't finish it up. I hadn't finished the test that I've got you for the Old Testament, but I'm working on a test for each one of these books. Just going to be about 12, 15 questions is all it's going to be. But each one of you will get an opportunity to answer those questions. And when you answer those questions, I feel like that will help you, and I hope that you all feel the same way. If I ask you, I say, what chapter in the Bible do we find in the book of Matthew where Jesus chose the disciples? You'll be able to answer that. What chapter in the Bible do we find where Jesus was crucified in the book of Matthew? Yeah, and those are just simple questions, and you're going to get probably 10 to 12 questions, each one of you, and I'll have Ian run them off, or some of all y'all, that help me. Y'all will run these off, and we'll get a little test for each one of these books that we're going to look at. And I believe by the time we're finished that we'll know a lot more about the Bible. Now tonight we're going to do just a little bit of an overview of Mark. Now let me tell you, if Jesus is in the book of Matthew, and it's a Jew, Matthew is writing to the Jewish nation about Jesus, okay? That's important. You want to know who the author is and who he's writing to, what's he writing about, and why is he doing it, okay? That's going to be the most important thing that I want you to grasp about each one of these books. Now, tonight, Mark, this is a totally different author. This is a totally different recipient of the book. As we think about Mark, Mark is writing about Jesus, and he's writing not to the Jews, but he's writing to the Gentiles, okay? The Gentiles are not Jews. That's what we are. We are Gentiles. We're not Jews, okay? I don't think any of us are anyway. But Mark is writing about some of the things that Matthew wrote about, but he's also writing to a different group of people. And that's the reason that the books are a little bit different in the way that they're put together, because the author is very important, and the recipient is very important. And to understand the New Testament, you need to know something about the author, what's he writing about, and what in the world is so significant about who's getting this, who's going to receive this book, this letter that's being written here. Now, tonight, Mark writes to the Gentiles, so you got to keep that in your mind. Mark's the author. He's writing to the Gentiles. Now, we're going to find out who Mark is. In Mark chapter 10 and verse 45, this is probably the most important verse of Scripture that you'll want to remember in the book of Mark. Just like trying to remember back there in Matthew chapter 10, okay? That's very important. But let's talk about Mark chapter 10, okay? In Mark chapter 10, there's a passage of Scripture that says, "For even the Son of Man came not to minister unto." Now this tells you why that Jesus came into the world. He came not to minister unto, but to minister and to give his life a ransom for many. So why did he come into the world? What was the purpose for Jesus? The purpose for Jesus was he came not to be ministered unto, but he came to minister and to serve mankind. That's what his job was. So when you think about a minister, Jesus was not only what we call the Son of God, the Son of David, the Son of Man. There's all kind of names that Jesus had. But he was also a minister. And the reason he's a minister, he's ministering to all of the people that Mark's writing to, the Gentiles. He said, this is why Jesus came here. Not to be ministered unto. He doesn't need people to do anything for him. He's the Son of God. He has the power that God had given him. But he came here to minister unto the people. Now, how is he going to minister unto the people? That's one of the most important things about the Gospels. In Mark's writing about Jesus, he's writing about what Jesus is doing to perform the ministry to the people. Well, what in the world is he going to do? Well, I'll tell you what he's going to do. He's going to serve the people, do all kinds of things for the people, like performing miracles, making them well, doing healing diseases and all of that. But he's also going to minister unto the people in the way of offering himself as a sacrifice. So if I say, how did Jesus minister to the people? He came to serve the people, but he also came to die. And in that dying, he served the people because he gave the ability to have the sins forgiven. Now, Mark writes all about this. This is what Mark is trying to do. These are not the Jews. These are the Gentiles, and they know very little concerning Jesus except for what Mark can tell them. And Mark says Jesus is good. He's came here to serve, and he's came here to sacrifice. And this is why he's writing this to the Gentiles. Now, the Jews, they looked at it totally different because Jesus was Jew. He's part of them. The Gentiles is looking at somebody that's not part of them. This is a Jew, and the Jew and the Gentile were actually enemies. And the Jews were favored because of the covenant under the Old Testament that we learned about that was given through that of Abraham. Okay? Now, let's go and look at this for just a minute. Mark depicts Christ in his letter to the Gentiles as a ministering servant to the needs of all the other people that Jesus needs to minister to, even to die the death on the cross. And this is in the book of Mark. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. Now, Mark is very special in the way that he puts this together for the Gentiles. He brings it out that Christ, even after his resurrection from the dead, even after he dies upon the cross and he's raised back again, and in the book of Mark we have all of the depiction of Jesus going to the cross and being put to death and being raised back again, and after his resurrection, this is what Mark says: we have a job to do. And you Gentiles have got to help. And the job we've got to do is to continue on to do what Jesus came here for in the first place, to continue to spread and to preach and to teach the gospel and those things that Jesus taught us while he was here. Now, Mark had a Hebrew name in the Bible. And, when I say a Hebrew name, I don't want you to really dwell on different names because I want you to remember Mark and who he was. But the Hebrew name for Mark was John. And, you can look at that over there in the book of Acts and you can see that. But his surname was Mark. Somebody says, well, what's a surname? Some people have more than one name. Anybody know anybody's got more than one name? There's a lot of people that do. Okay, well, John Mark had two names. And this particular surname, used Mark, is what the Bible, the second gospel of the New Testament, is actually about. Mark. Hey, buddy. But anyway, when you think about this, Peter evidently, now Peter's different. Okay, Peter, James, and John, Philip and Bartholomew. Peter evidently had led Mark to Christ. Now, Mark wasn't a Christian to start with. Okay, he did not know anything about becoming a Christian. Apparently, somewhere along the way, he was taught, and he became a Christian, and then he became one of those that Jesus has chosen. And Mark is writing the letter to the Gentiles to help them to understand what he didn't understand to begin with. And he was taught himself, and apparently, from every indication that we have, Peter himself actually taught Mark and baptized Mark. Now, I don't have any proof on that, but most all of your good commentators and most of your good study Bibles and all makes reference to that fact, that Peter himself actually baptized Mark into Christ. Then Mark became that of the author of the second of the Gospels in the New Testament. So, in Mark chapter 14 and verse 15, or verse 50 rather, this is what's sad, guys, and I want you to remember, what's sad in the book of Matthew is the crucifixion in chapter 27 and a lot of things that went before that. Here's something real sad in the book of Mark. Whenever Jesus was going to be crucified, and the Roman soldiers had come to take Jesus and put him on the cross. His disciples was all alive. They did not stand up for Jesus. They forsook him. And in chapter 12 and verse number 50, we have one of the, chapter 14 and verse number 50 rather, we have one of the saddest verses in the Bible to me. Whenever they came to get Jesus, this is what happened. They all forsook him. They left him. Now, that's a sad thing. All the disciples forsook him and they fled because they knew Jesus was going to be put to death. Well, Mark has already told them this is what's going to happen. But nevertheless, whenever it came down to coming and arresting Jesus, this is what they did. They all ran away. Now, that's a sad part of what Mark tells us about when it comes down to Jesus. In Mark 14 and verse 50, all the disciples forsook him and they fled. Now, you will learn when we get over to the book of Acts, and this is just something to give you a pretext to this, there were things called missionary journeys. Do y'all know what a missionary journey is? Okay, that's when a missionary goes on a journey, and he's out there and he's preaching and teaching other people about Christ. Well, there were going to be missionary journeys that's going to be involved, and Mark's going to be involved in them. Now, even after Jesus' death, these men carried on. They came back. They fled. They forsook him when they killed him, but they continued on with his work later on whenever they understood after the resurrection, Jesus was who he says he was. And he was resurrected back to life. And after he came back from the dead, and they knew that, they continued on to do the things that Jesus required of them, which was to preach and to teach his word. Now, understand, this is the simplest way I know to teach young people and older people too. In the first missionary journey, there was a problem in Acts chapter 12 and verse 25. Mark's involved in this. He was a man who did not stay with Paul in carrying out the missionary journey. He left early. In other words, he quit, went back. He didn't want to stay. This caused a big deal in the Bible. There was a lot of controversy over this. Barnabas and Saul, they were the ones that were out there preaching and teaching the gospel. And Mark was supposed to be one of those within that group too. And he was for a period of time, but he got scared and he left. From that standpoint, it caused a great problem among Paul and Barnabas about this. So the first missionary journey, Mark left early and returned back to Jerusalem where they were at that time early, and Paul refused to let him go back. He didn't like him. He thought he had given up. He was weak. But Mark wasn't weak. He was just fearful. He was afraid. And so he left. Now these men are out here preaching and teaching about Jesus. He's already been put to death on the cross. He's already been resurrected back to life. But a lot of people didn't know that, and they're scared to death. And they're out here trying to preach and teach the gospel to a lost and dying nation, and they're talking about Christ, and they're fearful. And Mark was one of them. So Mark was one of the ones that was fearful and left off of the missionary journey, which caused a problem between two of those who preached to the people during this period of time. Now, Paul allowed people all the way through forgiveness as he did Mark. He forgave Mark and he took him back. And Mark came back and he repented and he went back on the missionary journey with him and said, I'm sad that I quit, that I left. And so he went back and he's gone back to preach the gospel again. So he himself shows in his gospel about the forgiveness. Now, he was a helpmate in preaching and teaching. Now, most believe, I don't know this for a fact, I can't tell you this for sure, but when we say Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, okay, that's the first 4 books of the New Testament. But in chronological order, if you think about who really and truly was first, most people believe, if you look at the chronological order of this, that Mark probably was the first of the Gospels, not Matthew. In other words, that means Matthew was written later than Mark. So I don't know that for sure, but that's one of the points that people make whenever they're looking at the chronological order of the Bible. They put Mark ahead of Matthew. Now, I don't do that, and I wouldn't advise anybody else to do that. Take the Bible for what it is and study it as it is, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But Mark is probably the first of the Gospels accordingly. Now, Mark tells us in his writing, and this is important, Mark tells us in his writing that Christ, he's very active, he's compassionate, he's humble, he's obedient, he's a servant. Y'all listen to him. He's got a plan. This is how you can be saved. This is how you can go to heaven. And this is what Mark is trying to tell the people. And he's writing to the Gentiles, which never has had a covenant, never has had any kind of rules and stuff to obey and to live by to go to heaven. So Mark's trying to get them on board, and he says, look, Jesus is the ultimate servant. He's the one that came here, and he didn't just come here for the Jews. He came here for all of us too. And he's telling the Gentiles, this is what it's all about. Jesus is here for us. He wants us to obey his will. He wants us to understand what heaven is all about. He wants us to know that we can. And that's what Mark's trying to do with the Gentiles. That's why it's so different from Matthew to Mark about what goes on in the Scripture. So, Mark depicts Christ as active. He says he's compassionate. He's not only compassionate, but he's obedient. He's a servant, he says, and he constantly is ministering physically and spiritually, and he's willing to die, and he does. So that's really what Mark is telling us. Now, Mark identifies Christ in his passages. If you look at it and you read it, it doesn't take long to read the book of Mark. It's not very, very long. Identify Christ as a unique servant, and he's no less than the Son of God. He's who he says he is, and you need to believe that, and that's what Mark is telling them in his book. Christ is the servant, but he's also the Redeemer. Now, you know what the Redeemer is? He's the one that rescues. I want you to remember there's only 16 chapters in the book of Mark. Okay? There's 28 in Matthew, 27 on the crucifixion there in Matthew, but when you think about Mark, he's only got 16 chapters in there. So, how many chapters are there? 16, okay? Mark convinced all of his readers that read his writing that Christ was rejected by his own people. Let me tell you how sad that was. Mark says, y'all won't believe this, but even Jesus' own family. I'm writing to you about this man that's going to bring to you salvation. But his own family and his own people, they rejected him. They neglected him and they rejected him. And Mark writes that in his book to tell the people about the rejection of Christ. And that's one of the saddest places in the Bible when you start reading about those that rejected Christ. That was his own family. So his own people. But ultimately, Mark says he becomes victorious over the fact that he defeated death. He was raised back to life after he died. You know. So this is what Mark is saying to the people. Hey, look, Jesus did die, but here's the deal. He was resurrected back again. He's back again. Now, I believe Mark to be the shortest and the simplest of the four Gospels. I've read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John a number of times in life. Mark to me is probably the shortest, but it's probably the simplest and the easiest to understand of any of the Gospels. It's not any of it hard to understand if you learn the author, the book, and a little bit of an overview about what this is about. Now, all this Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is about the gospel. This is about Jesus. This is about the things that we need to know about. This is why when you say Mark 16, 15, and 16, and And somebody said, well, what is that? He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved, and he that believeth not shall be doomed. You know, you start, a lot of things in these books here are just what we need to know. This is why the New Testament becomes so important, because this is what we have to go by. Okay, Mark, to me, in the 16 chapters, I don't know how long it would take you to read it, but I timed myself. And I believe that most of you guys, all of you, can probably read, maybe not as fast as I can, but you can read as good as I can. It only takes, if you really and truly sit down and try to read the 16 chapters, it only takes about 30 to 35 minutes to read it. Now, if it takes a little longer, that's fine. But it don't take very long to read the entire book of Mark. And you learn a lot about what the whole oversight is. And you learn some of the most important things like we're talking about tonight. Now, when you're looking at Christ, Mark says he's not only a preacher, he's a teacher. He heals. He's doing these things that needs to be done. But ultimately, after he preaches and he teaches and his people rejects him and everything, he's going to be put to death on the cross and he's going to die. But he's going to be raised back again. And he does. And so that's one of the biggest issues about the gospel and about the book of Mark. Now, most of what Mark writes about is about the last part of Jesus' life. Okay? He doesn't spend a lot of time on genealogy and birth and all of that like Matthew does, because there's no reason to. These are Gentiles, these are not Jews. What he's spending his time is, he's mainly focused on the last 7 or 8 days of Jesus' life. And that's right down to the very end of all of the time that Jesus has been on the earth, and he lived for 30 some odd years, 32 or 33 years on the earth. He spends most of his time writing about the latter end of Jesus' life, right before he goes to the cross, when he goes to the cross, and after he's put to death, and when he's raised back again. So that's really a very important part of the book of Mark. Now, chapters 1 through 10, you divide it into two different ways. And I think Brother Charles told me he did the same thing when he was studying Mark. You divide it in 2 different ways, in chapter 1 through chapter 10. Really and truly, that's about Christ's service. And that's about what Christ is about. And that's what he's doing. And he writes about the service of Christ and how to serve and what Jesus is doing. And then after you get past chapter 10 and you start in chapter 11 and you go through chapter 16, you're looking at the last part of Jesus' life, right before he goes to the cross and gets on and is put to death on the cross. So the last few verses there are the last few chapters from chapter 11 to chapter 16 is about Jesus' dying upon the cross and the things that happened and the things that all this was about. And so you divide it both ways. And you start 1 through 10, you're just looking at Jesus and what he's introducing Jesus as. A faithful servant who's going to do everything humanly possible to make things good for you as Gentiles, and he's eventually going to die on the cross for you. And then when you get up to the latter part of this, after chapter 10 and go into chapter 11 and get down to the 16th chapter, he talks about Jesus' service while he was on earth, but what Jesus brought about when he died and he was raised back again. That's why you would read in the book of Mark, he that believeth and is baptized. Jesus brought us a plan so that we could have the forgiveness of our sins. And Mark writes about that in the last 5 or 6 chapters in the book. Okay? Now, there's something else about this. You know, we haven't talked much about the temptation of Christ by Satan. But Mark depicts in his book when the old devil comes to tempt Christ. And that's one of those things that most of us probably need to take the time, sit down and read when the old devil comes to tempt Christ. You know, he's still with us today, he's still powerful, and he's still doing what he did best back then. He tempts people today in lots of ways. But he doesn't do it in the same way that he did that with Jesus. So, there's another thing about Mark. You find the Last Supper, you know, when Jesus is right at the end of his life, and he goes in there and he's eating with his disciples, and he's talking about, the fact that this is going to be it. I'm about to be killed. I'm going to be sacrificed, and I'm going to be crucified. So the last part of this, you have the Last Supper depicted in that of Mark. You also have within that the arrest, the abuse, and the crucifixion of Jesus. And what Mark tells them about is that Christ was willing to do this because He loves you. And this is what the book of Mark tells us. Now, let's go back for just a minute. How many chapters is it? 16. Can you divide it two ways for me? 1 through 10 tells us a little bit about Christ's service and all. What's the last part? Okay. All right, good. Now, here's something else. What are some of the most important things that we find, like some of the highlights of Matthew? Give me some kind of important event that comes about here. The crucifixion is one of them. But, there's a salvation. Mark 16, 15, 16. Anybody know?
On this rock I'll build my church.
No, not that one.
Oh, 16 and 18?
16, 15, and 16. Okay, but that one you talked about is two. He said, upon this rock I'll build my church, involved Peter making confession. Thou art Christ, the Son of the living God. And he says, upon this rock, this good confession, I build my church. I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it.